Welcome to Pigeon River Farm, doing farming right. I'm Robert Brown, the owner of Pigeon River Farm. Thank you for viewing. Good evening, and tonight's episode, we're going to do a deep dive with Mike Waters, the science guy.
Mike and I have worked together for, well, what has been well over a decade, and he's allowed the farm to prosper and achieve what we've been trying to achieve. So, Mike, tonight we want to talk about healthy animals. We're going to work on the immune system. What have I been doing on the farm here with the different plant types that I've been putting in, and all the proper nutrients and the soil management and so on. But the plants themselves, how do they benefit the animal and in turn ultimately benefit human health?
Okay, well, first of all, your farm has different soil zones. And so there's a correlation between the different soils and the different plants that will thrive.
Mm-hmm.
So in this picture here, this is a soil that's a little bit higher. Looks like it would be a silty, loamy soil with fairly decent drainage, looking at the grass varieties here. And so your varieties of grasses will tend to thrive as perennials and hold steady year by year as they're grazed. And you'll see that there's a few weeds out there, which will tell you a little bit about the soil, but actually your grasses are really thriving there. As we can see, they're really doing well. So the soil is matched up to the grasses. Now, what that means is that the plants will be healthy. And if I would do a leaf analysis and say, for example, I would do a Brix reading with the refractometer, I would see that the sugars are pretty decent. And then if I sent it to the lab for mineral analysis, we would see that it's well within the ranges of what those types of grasses should be, if not even a little higher on phosphorus, which correlates to the sugar content. And if we looked at the trace minerals, we would see where that is also. So those are handy tools to look at when we see that the variety of grass is thriving, and then we can see if the qualities are there that we're looking for. And obviously the cattle look very nice.
Well, one of my primary questions here then because we've done so much over the years of getting the right minerals, optimizing it both from a fertilizer standpoint and from an animal nutrition standpoint. And plus I've been using a lot of the sprays to support the plant vigor and support, like for example, we use the nitrogen fixing bacteria, so that I know there's 14 different species in that. We ended up using a product that has iodine and selenium in it. We've had boron. So I mean, of course, we get into the micronutrients, we've applied that. How ultimately does that make it into the animal and benefit both through the poultry and through the beef cattle? Metabolically, what happens when they're like this cow that's in front of us here, as she's eating away at the pasture, that uptake is going to go through the whole process within the animal, within the four stomachs and so on. But how does this feed differentiate from a farm that is not using that same quality? Or does it make a difference?
Okay, now being ruminant animals, we have to remember that first we're feeding the fermentation in the rumen. And in ruminants, the minerals will become part of the microbial bodies, the ruminant bacteria, the yeast. There's all the different organisms that are in there digesting the rumen, in the rumen. And so especially your selenium will be taken up, and that's how it's delivered. It's broken down into a basic elemental form, and then it's absorbed into a rumen microbe, and that is how it gets best delivered into the bloodstream as the ruminant material passes down through the intestines. And iodine is a little bit different. That is taken up and chelated also, but iodine will tend to free flow. Your magnesium will tend to be free flowing in through the blood serum. So that can be just taken up as a mineral in the intestines. It doesn't need in the same way, to be chelated like selenium does. But those are the mixtures. So with the ruminant, the number one way of taking the minerals from the grasses into the bloodstream and into all of their cells is through the ruminant bacteria chelating the minerals and then going into the being digested and going into the bloodstream of the cow in that form. So each one has a different function, and the plants have slightly different needs than what the animals do. And so, for example, I found it's much better to put the boron onto the plant, for example, as foliar feeding, or even just put it on in a dry form at a larger rate onto the soil, because the boron will actually have more synergistic effects going through the plant into the animal, whereas a selenium isn't a big need for the animal, but the plants can take up adequate selenium so that the selenium can be chelated and delivered into the bloodstream in a chelated form.
Okay, so as we were saying there, so we have now I apply the boron and selenium both in a dry form on a pasture, and then I also do a spray typically 3 to 5 times per year onto the plants.
Well, another thing about the selenium and iodine, as well as the boron, is that since we're in a more humid area, which is originally a wooded type of environment, we have very little of the boron, selenium, or the iodine in our soils. Whereas the more arid soils out west have good reserves of those things. So, as you go out west, you'll find higher and higher rates to where the boron is excess, the selenium is excess, and the iodine tends to be in the sea salt or in like the Great Salt Lake or the oceans. So the iodine is probably the number one thing that'll be short most everywhere. One of the ideas about years ago was that they would buy, for example, wheat midds from the West and feed that to the cows as a selenium source. And maybe they didn't know that it was a selenium source, but they knew the cows were healthier when they fed the wheat midds.
That brings up an interesting topic. One thing that's been relatively popular, I've applied it a couple times. I bought premium Western hay, and then additionally, we are using some premium alfalfa for the poultry feed. Per your mix, I have ordered up the most luscious organic alfalfa hay that is available from the Great Plains. It comes out of the Wyoming area. Specifically for that, plus it's a really good quality. So most everything on the hay end of it we use, that's all local. That is one that I bring in, so that is an external source of minerals. That was kind of the intention, plus the quality is so high. With now that you identify the means at which the animal is able to get access to mineral, is there a variance in plant type? As you can see here, we've got a lot of the longer stem grasses in this particular field. There is some plantain in there, there's dandelions and so on. But how do these longer stem grasses have an effect? You have the list there of grasses that I've planted. And what's your, what's your feeling there on a particular species uptakes a different mineral type, as far as there again, back to the animal's health, the immune system, and ultimately to our consumer?
Well, one of the subjects we talked about at the conference was a slightly less intensive system will allow the different varieties of grasses Not only that, it's a better range for the wild birds, and it gives the animals an opportunity to search around and look for the plants that have different minerals. And so they went through the different alkaloids, terpenins, and the various organic and mineral combinations that are in the different plants just because of their genetics. So if we very intensively graze, we won't have the variety. But if we let it be a little bit more come what may, not be grazing it with moving them twice a day, etc., and allow the weeds, what we call weeds, to grow, well, then the animals can kind of choose to go and have a plantain or a dandelion, which would be higher on different compounds that they might be wanting to have. They're lacking a little bit. And so that's one of the benefits of not just making it a total production system, is that we have a variety of grasses that have different genetics. So if the animal is wanting, for example, a little more manganese, there's certain plants that'll be higher in manganese. For example, your pigweeds or the various, like alfalfa will have terpenines in it. And some animals might like that and some may not. Others would have the alkaloids. Now with the plantain, that's a very healing and soothing plant, very good for the cow's guts, soothing the gut linings. That is something that'd be very good for the animals to have, but it doesn't really produce the tonnage. So if we just do everything for maximum production, we're going to be selecting management methods that don't allow those things to really develop because the grazing intensity is so great.
You bring that up, and that's really been the model since you've been working with me really from the onset here, is to try to put quality is number one. The quality of health for the soil, for the plants, for the animal, and ultimately for the human has been paramount. Unfortunately, the challenge with that is it's very expensive to do. Quality costs. Quite different than the high production systems, from the bunk feeding with the big silage operations as being probably the most cost effective, and to high intensity grazing and very efficient. But I agree, you're not getting that nutrient. And we know that within the human health, we're so deficient. You got to figure agricultural now, we're going into, well, I guess numbers I've heard about 80 years worth of decline, where we really have been just mining the soil, not replenishing, and the animals themselves have suffered, and ultimately within the human population, not having access to these almighty micronutrients that make us so healthy. So my model has been to do the slow motion, like on the pasture here. We typically, there's the magic, graze it down to 4 inches. We always move it at the 4-inch level, but I've gone with the larger paddocks approach, and we normally are able to maintain 1 to 3 days of grazing per paddock. Then respectively, if we start getting shy on hay, then I'll allow summer feeding. We'll actually cut off of some of the non-fenced in land. And then so a lot of my neighbors give me that funny eye when they see me out there feeding bales in the middle of July, even though it's not droughty, but that allows us to manage the pasture very efficiently. So to your recommendation, we have followed that, and it's worked very well. So within the grasses, again, kind of the question there, is there, I put in quite a variety of different grasses. Is anything there really jump out at you as being a better fit for our soil type here, our region?
Well, I think it just goes according to the local soil zone, and I think you have a few different types of soils within your pastures system there. For example, up in front here, there's a little better drainage.
Yeah, that
So
would
you'll
actually
have,
be, make that as a classification in Wisconsin here is a Hortonville loam soil. So as you
yes,
described it,
yes.
it's a very fertile soil. It's kind of in our county, it's classified as the gold standard. So I'm very blessed to have that style of soil, at least on part of the farm.
And talking to my grandfather years ago, he explained all of that to me, and he wished so much that his farm had all of your soil. He said if he could farm any place else, it would be right in your neighborhood.
I have a good friend that has a large organic farm a little bit north of us here, and he always teases me of it's easy to farm down in the Nile Valley. So
Exactly.
that's so the good humor. It has its challenges. We're still way northern tier of the state, so we get the harsh winter, but we are very blessed from that, and I'm really trying to leverage it. This land prior to me homesteading it and setting up the farm operation, if you recall, was a cash crop, and it was really a corn bean, corn bean, corn bean. And you know, fortunately, I guess for me, at the time of my purchase, genetically modified crops were just coming on board, so it had a limited number of years of glyphosate and GMOs. So now
Mhm.
we're going back to there has been zero chemicals, zero genetically modified plants of any type on the soil since 1999. So it would have been prior to 99 where anything of that nature happened. So I wish it had been longer, but at least we're able to put out the fire then. I have adjoining property that neighbor runs, and they do a corn bean rotation, and it is relatively sad. Same exact soil, and you can see there's no vigor, no vigor left in it. We're here the animals with the symbiotic relationship have put the vigor back into soil. So you got to realize that 20 years ago, this was just simply plowed farmland with every bit of nutrient being stolen out of it. And thanks to you, we've put a lot of Mother Nature back in.
Well, if we look at the grasses and the dandelions here, we see that we have two different layers of soil that you're drawing nutrients from. Your grasses tend to be a shallower root, but dandelions will put a taproot down deep. And so when the dandelion greens come up, they'll have some of those minerals that just reverted back when the soil was just, well, okay, to describe what happens is the corn and bean cash croppers put a lot of salt fertilizer. And what I mean by salt fertilizer is that it's a mineral connected to a mineral. And on that type of fertilizer, there tends to be reversion. So when, for example, the potassium is released from the chlorine will gas off. Of course, that kills life in the soil. And but it can, the other way is it can combine with the magnesium and go down. So you'll have magnesium chloride deposits down in the hard pan area. The other thing that happens with phosphorus is the phosphorus will revert back to an iron phosphate or a calcium phosphate. And the dandelions have the ability to tap into those mineral to mineral concretions. It's actually what you're doing is they're in the form of concrete in the soil. So the more variety of plants and the more life you have in the soil, the more you can draw on those old salted fertilizers that were only partially used for the growing crop. And that's one of the things that I've found in working with the farmers through the years is after they get a little bit of life in the soil, all of a sudden, all of those minerals release. And we can have some incredible crops growing with high trace mineral contents because now they're unlocked. And so the various plants will have different growth zones. But the neat thing about dandelions is they'll go down, they'll have a taproot, they'll dig into the concreted soil, and they'll draw the nutrients out that were otherwise unavailable. And that's why they're so high in nutrition.
So, Mike, does that account for the reason I've had such really good luck with both pregnancy of the cows, calving, and I said I'd have no fear of calving year round. Our animals come out very healthy. We've had very little health problems overall, and I guess to my detriment or pleasure, which depending on which way you want to look at it, our animals age very well. We've got some very old cows on the farm. I have some of these cows now are getting up into the late teens and still putting out calves and still are very healthy. We just don't have the, I guess we'd say, age-related problem that most farms do, where they're just working the heck out of the animals. Plus, with the poultry on pasture, again, I have got a lot of old hens, typically 4, 5, 6, some are even 7 years old, that are still moving along. They're actually laying eggs, not very productive anymore, but the health. And we've also been very blessed. I've not fought any diseases. We have disease all around us. Around us on all fronts, I have lots of conventional farms stretching out for really probably 100 miles in almost all directions here. And that toxicity is around. And I've been very blessed that it has not hit us. And I contribute the immune system that we've built up within the animals, within the soil, within the plant life.
That's exactly right. And you're bringing life back to the land, and you're regenerating the ecology of your farm so that it's a sustainable ecology. And that's what we need, is to have a sustainable ecology that promotes health, even if it isn't the highest level of factory type production. And that's one thing that our agricultural system is going to, is to make the farm into a factory where you have the maximum efficiency on just one thing. And one thing is measured by production and by dollars of income per unit there.
There was an old saying that I recall is, would you want to eat your meal off the factory floor? And I have had the, I guess we'd say, the experience here of touring a lot of conventional farms, a lot of large CAFOs I've toured. I'm always very respectful to other people's methodologies, so I never say anything derogatory, even though sometime when you're an organic, healthy farmer, that favor is not repeated in the other direction. But that aside, it's very interesting watching mechanisms. I appreciate technology, as I guess we all appreciate technology. So from a cheap food standpoint, we're very blessed. We have the ability to have such inexpensive food, but the harsh reality of that is that cheap, inexpensive food is causing such a health problem, both in the animal and then ultimately in the human. And that's
Exactly
across the
correct.
board.
Yeah.
It isn't just the animal proteins, and that's kind of got a bad rap lately, but it's also the plant proteins that humans consume. We do a lot, and I'm going to bring up some pictures here. This is areas that we have been regenerating and putting in a large brassica mix along with buckwheat and field peas and Sudan sorghum, even corn. We've put all of that in there, and then the cattle graze this, and this regenerates the soil, and in turn, we think gives a real boost for the health of the animal, boost the immune system. So you can see there, Mike, I have a variety of different plants. I mean, we got turnips, we got the purple top turnips in there. We got a kale, there's sunflower, there's barley, there's buckwheat, just to name a few. But I know the big discussion now even within the vegan community is kale, and the nutrient value of kale. Now, we planted in there as an animal feed, along with the turnips and along with the radish are put in there. So these plants will put down, like you mentioned earlier, incredibly deep taproots. I was at a demonstration recently, and these were turnips that weren't even allowed to go full cycle. They were intended just to loosen up the soil. and they had dug down with a backhoe, and we were down to 8 feet, and the roots were still going down into the soil, relatively large roots. Now here I've got turnips that are very sizable, that turn into a winter feed. Here's after the fact, but there's very large turnips out there. So the animals are able to eat that from the very beginning, but this would be normally at the rate that where I'd feed them. So what benefit would we find? How does this really help both the poultry and the cattle help their immune system? What comes out of these broadleafs?
Well, the first point to make is that they are an annual crop. You plant them, and their best grazing time is after the other grasses are going into winter dormancy. And so it's a way of extending the green season. In other words, the brassicas can be very high in lutein, and that will not only benefit the health of the animals, but it will also have a higher lutein content coming through with the eggs. And as we saw this year, as we phased down and there were less green plants, we needed to up their supplement because they weren't, the green grasses are providing so much. And so that's actually an amazing thing to watch, how the animals will have a natural craving for more supplements as we go off the grasses. And I've seen it over and over where in mid-season, the animals won't even want to free choice very much of the minerals and vitamin supplements at all. But then when we get into the winter season, their rate goes up. But when we look at the things that come from the greens, that's actually what increases the quality of for example, the milk and the eggs and the beef. It'll be 2, 3, 4, 5 times higher on some of these nutrients, such as the vitamin K. The K2 especially is short in the human diet, and that comes from the green grasses or from these green brassicas. The lutein, the zeaxanthins, the astaxanthins are just so important for us, especially for eye health. Along with, we have a lot of carotenes, the beta carotenes in the green grasses. And those things are very expensive to supplement one-to-one. For example, I can buy all these things where they take the different plants and they concentrate the beta carotene, but it's very expensive to buy the actual things that are in the green plants. And so the best way to keep up the soil, plant, animal, and human health is through the pasturing system. And by extending the system out, we're just extending the benefits. And as you said, it's a annual crop. You're reconditioning the soil by having these plants with the deep tap roots, and then they can be cycled back into the grasses and clovers, and it's a benefit because, for example, if there's a field that got puddled, or the weather was too wet and there's hard pans or whatever, just from getting stuck and trying to get equipment out, it's an excellent way to regenerate within the rotation.
Well, to that exact point, because of the last 2 years being unusually wet, we've had some compaction issues. No matter how much I'm trying to be gentle with the equipment, we still have compaction with the cattle. And we have taken the approach over the years of no tilling into our existing pasture this type of plant. So I guess the deep-seated question I have from kind of a follow-up to what you said before, as these different vitamins and minerals are being brought up and making accessible to the cattle, we know that there's a big benefit to the cattle's manure and the urine. So how much of it actually goes in and turns into protein in the animal, and then how much gets returned to the pasture, and how well does it get pulled up?
Well, this is the part about agriculture that when I was younger, I didn't understand. Because of the total system, most of it goes back to the land, to the creatures that live there, the microbes, the earthworms, and we as humans only get a small percentage of what is actually produced. And on a farm, the number one product is manure. So, and I didn't understand that when I was young. I was thinking efficiency, like kind of like the factory farm model. But then as I got older, well, I started understanding. And we need to have carbon in our soils in the form of humus. The more carbon we have in our soils in the form of humus, the better the whole ecology of the soil is, because the humus holds on to the minerals that makes them non-soluble. They won't wash away, but they're available as nutrients. And then when we hear about the excess carbon now in our atmosphere because of burning all the petroleum fuels, well, one of the best ways to sequester carbon is in the soil. And so if we can take our organic matter, our humus percents up even just a few percents, it's tons and tons and tons of carbon per acre, because there's 2 million pounds of soil per acre. So if you do the math, it takes a lot of carbon to truly build a healthy soil. And then all these little earthworms and microbes are working for you. They're making your soil softer. They're drilling air holes in so that there's better drainage. And it's a whole ecology of itself. And so we need to know who our workers are on the farm and feed them. And so really what we take is, you might say, the cream off the top, with most of what the sun is producing in carbohydrates goes back to the soil. And the more we can focus on returning it to the soil, the greater the health the soil has, and the more humus we have, which in turn makes the plants healthier. And I can go into a lot of detailed reasons about why I started to learn at college, all the technical reasons, but that's a little overview of why it's good to put more back in the soil than we take away from it.
Well, to that exact point, so with the additional CO2, so the additional carbon that is in the atmosphere right now, this may be kind of a far-reaching question here, but do we actually get more soil built with the proper sequestering than we would have, say, 100 years ago? Is there kind of an inverse effect that can occur because of having an atmospheric change? In turn, if the same practice, say 100 years ago, let's say 1920, versus now, do we build soil at a faster rate?
Oh yeah, it's possible. And that was always one of my key things that I was hoping to do, was to work toward sequestering more carbon in the soil, because carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. It increases plant growth. And if we can select the varieties of crops that have more roots, have more stems, and we can take all of the photons that are coming from the sun and create carbohydrates, well, that's all the more carbon we can sequester into the roots. But science, quote unquote, is going the other way. They're looking for shorter stemmed grains. They're looking to have less roots and then put the fertilizer right alongside the root. And if we look at, say, for example, a 100-year-old variety of open pollinated corn, well, that might grow 15, 16, 20 feet tall, but it would be putting more carbon into things that we can't harvest. So sure, there will be a nice cob of corn there, but the way the genetics has been moving is to have less and less stalk and less roots and more corn grain per acre. Well, that's counterproductive to the whole ecology. And so we're losing organic matter just from that one perspective of selecting for higher yielding crops with less wasted roots, as they would look at it, and less wasted stalk. So it's a big thing to me. We need to look at the whole ecology.
Mike, you really hit the nail on the head there. Back in the days when I used to row crop before we went to complete grazing operation, I utilized the very thing you're discussing here. What we did is we would utilize Minnesota 13, happened to be one of the open pollinated corn. It's a little challenging compared to the new genetically modified super corn that's out there, but it was so robust. It was so healthy. It was also very tall, like you described. We were getting typically 10, 12, 14-foot stalks, would get 3 cobs per plant. And the soil, when I would work the soil up after picking it, was so mellow. The stalks were, I would say, more supple because the new stalks on the new plants are just brutal. And the animal health, when we were still producing our own corn, we could definitely tell that they wanted the corn that came off of our soils. So with all that said, now I've got a lot of years of putting in all these minerals and vitamins. I have all these years of it, these deep-rooted plants that we've taken on, bringing the minerals up from down below. The ones have been entrapped, as you stated, in concrete, literally built concrete down below. We're slowly breaking it up with all the microbial life. And these deep taproots that can go down as much as 15 feet, we are very, that is getting to the surface now. So the soil that's built, as I add organic matter, as we build, possibly maybe in my generation, I will get an inch or two of soil replaced. That's an awful lot of carbon. So I guess I can take credit for a little. You can take credit for getting me there. Respectively, what is the density ratio of that soil? So let's take 1999 when it was conventional farmed, and it will go up there to 2000. I've added some soil. We brought a lot of nutrients onto the farm. We pulled some up from down below. We've made it stuff that was entrapped. What would be the soil enhancement to the different elements and vitamins that would be in the soil?
Well, the soil structure changes when we do what you're doing. And one of the things I learned working on the heavy clay soils in this area is that, I'll just do it with my hands, that clay will be in platelets. So when we're talking about concretions, minerals, especially magnesium and potassium, will pull the soil platelets together. And that's one of the forms of making concrete. Okay, now the soil prefers to have the calcium. So once things start to get a little bit more alive and we get some earthworms down there and we add the supplements, the soil would prefer to have one plate not flat to each other, but flocculated. Is, we have, they're standing on each other like that, and that's a granular situation. So the soil prefers, and with enough life, the soil by itself will pull on the calcium and be flocculated, which you'll see it's being more granular instead of puddled. So that's one thing that happens partially through adding minerals. For example, calcium sulfate is a good way to exchange out a potassium or a magnesium from a concreted clay platelet, and then to flocculate it so that it's granular instead of just say if you walk in a field and if the mud sticks to your boots, you know that your soil is all, the platelets are all like that, and then the charges are such that it's going to stick to your boot. When the soil is flocculated properly, it doesn't stick to your boot because the electrical charges are balanced. And that gets into the whole electrical side of the clay platelets. But I've actually experienced that where the soil will become granular and it'll look like the farm just dried out. There's no more puddling and water puddles and all. It just, the water drains normally not only because you have uh, the clay platelets flocculated, but then you have life in the soil. So you have channels made by the living organisms, especially the earthworms, where the water can flow downward or upward. And then another aspect of all those living bugs in the soil is their bodies are composed of a wax-like substance called chitin, and that coats the soil and eventually becomes humus. But of itself, it gives the soil a more granular structure. So a healthy soil is a well-flocculated soil with good drainage. And if that isn't so, then you have electrical imbalances which tie up nutrients.
So once we've worked real hard at getting the soil where it needs to be, so the accessibility for the plant to bring that up, would we say more efficiently in more volume? I mean, I always try to quantify this, and the tests for this are so brutally expensive.
Well, I can give you a few keys. The ideal electrical balance in a soil, whether it's clay-based or silt or sand-based, is that you have a certain percentage of calcium in the base saturation, a certain percentage of magnesium, a certain percentage of potassium. There are ideal ratios to get a good electrical balance in the soil. Now, the interesting thing about this is that 80% of the crops that are beneficial for humans thrive at those ratios. And then the correlating factor is that humus stores the minerals, because humus has a negative charge, just like clay. Humus will, by itself, regulate the percentages. So humus actually balances the soil to the exact percentages to get the electrical charge balanced for the optimum nutrition of 80% of the crops that are beneficial to humans. And so it's like an 80-20 rule, which goes through many things, you know, in many principles. But if you have proper humus in the soil and life, the soil itself will naturally balance your minerals to the exact ratio to favor the very best crops for human life.
Well, you remember back before we got out of the vegetable business, that was about 4 years ago. Prior to that, we were integrating in vegetables into part of our grazing system. We'd take a field out for a year and turn that into, we were growing for Organic Valley. We were doing winter squash and beets, and unbelievable results. It just, the quality of the plant, and we got complimented so many times on the taste. And we know that when you're shy on certain nutrients, you're going to crave, you know, nature kicks in. And even in humans, even with all our synthetic food that we consume, when we're lacking in this and you get access to food that is highly enriched, you have a desire. It becomes candy, so to speak.
Mhm.
So we were really impressed. That was quite a time. I wish we'd have been able to continue it, but labor just didn't allow that. And so we have been, I guess, systematically here now stockpiling these nutrients and making them available through our protein sources. Now, you know, our eggs are kind of our primary source of human food that we produce. The beef business is purely a secondary business, but we know the lion's share of the work out in the pasture is done by the cattle. The cattle are consuming all these different plants we've talked about in that environment very efficiently and in very large volume. And then the chickens follow up behind the cattle, and they're eating the greens. They are taking advantage of the bugs, and respectively, they're also taking care of them manure patties in short order, and in turn, we've had great feedback on the quality of eggs that we produce, and then in turn, chickens are given that manure back onto the pasture in such a nice divided up methodology.
Exactly. And the chickens add certain types of bacteria that are beneficial to the cows. It's not only the cows benefiting the chickens, but it's the vice versa by having chickens in the same pasture with cows, because they have a slightly different type of stomach, and they do add life to the soil in a different way, as well as not only stirring everything up and shredding the manure piles. And you also have the dung beetles, which are right in there. That's one of your other little workforces there that you're feeding with all of the nutrients that you're not able to sell, of course, but it's feeding the dung beetles, it's feeding the earthworms, and it all contributes to the ecology.
It's interesting when you look at value of farms and how that value system works. And we quantitatively measure the soil on, example, corn and soybean production levels. If you go to the Farm Bureau, you look any of this stuff up, land is valued on how many bushel per acre it can produce. Nothing at all is considered both environmentally, what it can sequester carbon, the benefit to animal health, the benefit to human health, the longevity of the soil. None of them are put into place, and I find it is really a sad state of affairs when we look at things strictly at a production standpoint. Now, I fully understand the dollars and cents involved because, trust me, I am at an economic disadvantage against my competitors that can produce so cost effectively such a low quality product. It's expensive to produce a high quality product. It's one of the challenges in the farming business. So I don't know, how do we turn this around? It's one of the challenges. How does that ever get turned around?
Well, just to add to your point there, if you're raising corn just to sell to the mill, it doesn't matter whether it's fertile, whether it'll produce another corn plant. And so it's specifically short on the nutrients needed to be fertile. But now if you're growing seed corn, you'll be adding the boron in with your fertilizer mix. And then, especially with the open pollinated, I found that it really benefits with cobalt and molybdenum, which when I dealt with that, I had it chelated to humates for best absorption. But anything that we were using for seed, we had to have the trace minerals right up there in order just to have a fertile seed. But the seed doesn't need to be fertile to become animal feed. So already they're selling a lower quality product if it's feed versus seed. So these are all deliberate things that are done in order to get the most bushels per acre with the least expense. Because, say, for example, they feel it's not necessary for feeding cows to have good trace mineral contents or to have a fertile corn seed. It's just carbohydrates. So that's all they're looking for. But when you look at the total health of the total system, the animals don't have the health without the trace minerals. And I can't add boron and molybdenum to the mineral premixes. So already we're at a handicap compared to if it's raised properly right on the farm. And these are things that affect the human health, but it's not a straight linear one-to-one equation. It's a complex holistic equation. And you need to be looking at the living system as a whole in order to see these things.
Mike, we really covered some great subjects tonight. What we'll do in the future here is we're going to break these things down. We'll talk about how we put the nutrients onto the soil, how the minerals and vitamins get into the animals. We'll do a deeper dive on the plant type that are needed and the soils. And I guess we want to wrap this all up into human health and how to promote uh, quality human health, get that immune system in our ultimately the food. Food is medicine, and food should be building the immune system within the consumer. And my goal here is to try to have the absolute gold standard in that environment. So I really appreciate all the wisdom that you've shared. I'm sure our audience appreciates it, and we will be having another video very soon. So thank you and have a most wonderful evening.
Thank you.